I am today here with David Brockman of the University of California at Berkeley. David is an expert on the public opinion of housing regulation. Just for background, almost everybody who really looks at the issue of housing seriously comes away thinking that we have a crazy level of regulation, that we are needlessly strangling housing supply, and yet the policies that exist seem very popular. Most economists just say, well, yeah, of course these policies are popular because the typical person who votes in a local election is a homeowner. Homeowners totally benefit. Nothing to see here move along. It's dysfunctional, but totally comprehensible. And I believe David's got a different story. So, did I just say anything wrong, David?
Yeah, well, I guess the one thing is I wouldn't call myself an expert in the public opinion on housing. I would say an expert on kind of public opinion in general in American politics. And then this paper we're talking about today, co-authored with Josh Kalla at Yale and Chris Elmendorf at UC Davis, is actually my first foray as an academic into this issue. And yeah, you're right that I would say there's kind of two prevailing explanations out there for trying to understand our problem of anti-development sentiment and NIMBYism and anti housing supply policies. I think one is the general phenomenon of NIMBYism, that essentially
Mm-hmm.
there's these hyper local negative externalities of new construction. Think about the construction noise or some or that.
Parking, traffic,
Yeah, exactly.
character of the neighborhood,
Right.
crime, everything's going to go wrong.
Yeah, so this kind of stuff, and then I think the second is, as you said, the thought that well, homeowners are just in this to increase their property values. I think the NIMBYism, there's clearly something to that. The homeowner versus renter divide, it's just interesting, just in simple descriptive data. You look across a bunch of papers that have looked at this. And just generally, the homeowner renter differences in views on various questions about development are often not there. And if they are there, they're just really small. And so we find that same thing too. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, that's right. That I think that's often people's first explanation is like, that's those about those homeowners. And yeah, if you just look at simple descriptive data, it's like, yeah, maybe if you squint in some data sets, there's a difference of a point or two, but usually not that much on these kinds of questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that homeowners are very supportive, but then you look and say renters is supportive too. And it's not enough just to say that homeowner support, just people support this stuff, right?
Yeah, so I think this is part of what's interesting. So I live in San Francisco, probably one of the most infamous hotbeds of
Right. And you own or
anti-development.
you rent?
I own.
Ah,
So yes, and in one of the most infamous hotbeds of anti-development policies. And one of the things that got me sort of interested in this is thinking about it, and I'm a little bit active actually in my personal non-academic life, and I'm advocating for some more pro-housing policies in the city. And so just kind of looking around and trying to understand the politics of this, I was realizing a bunch of the people that show up to these planning commission meetings or whatever else are owners. On the other hand, you also have a bunch of people that show up and talk about their opposition to new housing using language, and when you see anti-development politicians and how they talk about their arguments, using language and arguments that really have nothing to do with these
mhm.
traditional factors. And so one of the things I started thinking about is, well, as a just kind of base, kind of default off-the-shelf framework, if you just had to say, take any given issue and you had to think about, well, what are the things you'd want to know to predict support or opposition? Self-interest, like we think about when it comes to owning versus renting, that might be one small part of the story. But of course, we have lots of examples on issues like there's plenty of women well past the age of of fertility that care a lot about abortion and are pro and con that. There's plenty of rich people that want to raise their taxes. There's plenty of poor people that are voting to lower rich people's taxes. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's just self-interest is part of the story of politics, but so is preferences and values.
I mean, there's some idea that, well, sure, that's fine at the national level, but at the local level, then everyone can see what side their bread is buttered on, but not so.
Yeah, and I think again, I think there's probably a little bit of that, but I think what I think need to do is expand our definition of what people care about beyond just simply, does my home value go up? And so in particular, as just one example to motivate some of this, we asked this survey question. We did a bunch of surveys of people across the country. We asked this survey question inspired by this recent bill in California AB 2011. And what this did is in a bunch of parts of the state allows five-story developments by right. There's some strings attached, as usual, with blue state pro-housing bills. But more or less, it says if you're in a kind of along a commercial a developer could build a five-story apartment building by right. Local NIMBYs can't say no. That's it. End of story. So we asked people this question: do you think cities should have to allow five-story apartment buildings to be built along major streets and in commercial areas? And if you said, okay, well, if we just had this self-interest point of view, who is going to support allowing more housing in dense, already dense areas of cities, and who's going to be opposed to it?
Mhm.
And you would think, if you think about me and my demographics, a renter, or sorry, an owner in a city, so like literally like where I'm looking at out my window right now, like is affected by this bill. I should be like the most opposed to this because I'd be like, oh, this new housing is going to be built by me, built near me.
Right.
And
Although not if you're going to sell out to the developer, right? There is that.
yes, let's come back to that because that's actually, I think, an interesting thing that I've never really understood why that doesn't kind of feature more in trying to appeal to homeowners. But yeah, so and I think part of it might be this limited impact of self-interest as why. But yeah, so we find basically if you look in cities, people who would traditionally be expected to oppose this policy, it's actually owners in cities, so people like me who are the most supportive.
Mhm.
So like, how does that make sense? And I think another way to think about this is, well, who selects into the crazy decision that I made of to own a condo in San Francisco? It must be someone who has a taste for density, right?
Mhm.
I commute to UC Berkeley on our public transit system, it takes me an hour each way. Like, why do I do this? Like that reveals that I like really care about density. I like living in walkable neighborhoods. Well, those are the kind of people who like density. And in fact, and so when we ask them a question like, do you think cities should have more five-story buildings? Our conjecture is, well, part of what people are just thinking about is, well, do I like dense cities? And in
Yeah.
fact,
Mhm.
your answer to the question of whether you think more five-story buildings should be allowed is really, really powerfully predicted by just a really simple question, which is, do you like cities or not? And people who say they like cities more are like, yes, cities should be more city-like. And people who don't like cities say, no, they should.
Have you got rural respondents in your data?
Yeah, and basically the more kind of urban your living environment is, the more it is that you think urban places should be even denser.
So
And the
like
more,
rural people just say stop five-story buildings, and it's like, what the hell difference does it make to you?
yeah. And this is actually one of the things, anecdotally in California that kind of got me interested in this is if you look at in the California state legislature, who are the state legislators who are the most kind of driving all of this kind of pro-housing legislation that we've had over the last few years, it's all the people who represent the densest areas. And so I think to me that suggests that there's a taste dimension to this, which is the people who have selected into dense areas like density. And the people who, thinking about some of my family members here who have selected into living in suburbs or rural areas or less dense areas, that reveals probably there's a lot of different things going on, but one of them is a taste for what kind of neighborhood you live in. And so we ask people about, okay, well, what kind of built environment should public policy encourage? They kind of answer in a way of like, well, more things should look like the way that I think things should look like in general, and the things that I like. And we
What
find
about people live in historic neighborhoods? Do they think that you should not be allowed to change an historic neighborhood, or is there not such an identity element with that?
Yeah. So we didn't ask about historic neighborhoods in particular, but that question does get at, another thing that we do in this paper, which is to say, okay, it's not just about that. We actually think this idea that when people think about housing, they're thinking about kind of their views on these kind of other issues like, oh, do I look at historic neighborhoods, that kind of stuff more generally. So I'll give you one example. Um, One of the things that we see in San Francisco that's I think I presented this paper at an economics conference and they were just kind of flabbergasted by is we do these experiments where we modify how we describe substantially similar policies. And so
Mhm.
one of the things that we do is we ask people how they feel about a new apartment building that would be put in their neighborhood. And we randomize whether or not we just describe it in a bunch of different ways, but including whether it's just an apartment building or a luxury apartment building.
Mhm.
That's inspired by part of the discourse I see here in the Bay Area, and you see in many progressive cities where the opposition to housing basically says, well, that those are just going to be luxury condos, and that's meant as kind of an epithet. And why is that done in a liberal place? My guess, and the data is consistent with this, is that what they're playing on is the fact that liberals, even wealthy liberals, kind of have a negative affect towards wealthy people.
Mhm.
And so,
Yeah.
and sure enough, what you find is that for most normal people, they don't really distinguish that much. Like the typical person
Mhm.
is not sensitive to whether or not you describe an apartment building as a five-story apartment building or a five-story luxury apartment building. But for people who have negative views towards rich people, that makes a huge difference and decreases their support by around 20 percentage points for a development.
Wow.
And we see that more generally too. So getting back to your historical example, I think the anti-development forces are very talented at finding ways to take pro-development policies and find sympathetic symbols or less sympathetic symbols. So think of it as, wealthy people or who's going to build the project or whatever else, and kind of introducing that into the mix so that people rely on their views towards those symbols, like quaint historic neighborhoods or whatever else, to judge the policy.
And do you view the anti-housing activists as really being cynical manipulators? Or you think they drink their own Kool-Aid?
Um, we don't have data on that in this
Yes,
project.
but what do you?
I will
Don't tell
say
me what
that,
you know. Tell me what you think.
yeah, I will say I think, in general, you see that, political ideology often has a bit of like a snake eating its own tail quality where, you know,
Ouroboros.
yeah, talking points are developed to persuade, and then people start to kind of believe their own talking points. And I think we see this on all political sides. I mean, frankly, I think we see it on the left as well, where, in California, one of the big challenges we face is that a lot of the laws that we have that have been trying to encourage more development come along with all of these, as Ezra Klein calls it, like toppings on the everything bagel. So, for example, in order to get access to the permit streamlining here in San Francisco under state law, to bypass all of our local NIMBY process, you have to have at least 10% of the units be set aside
Mhm.
for affordable housing.
Mhm.
And that sounds really nice to people because what politician wants to vote against affordable housing?
Mhm.
But the Turner Center at UC Berkeley has a great report on this. It's kind of like a Laffer curve situation where, like, when you tax new building by
Mhm.
requiring all these affordable units, you actually reduce the number of new units by way more than that. So maybe on
Yeah.
average, we get, one new affordable unit for every like 10 market rate units that
Mhm.
then are not built as a result.
Okay.
And so I think that's an example
And
where
so you think the elasticity is that high, really?
that's what the
10,
Turner
10,
Center research.
10% actually 10% leads to a substantial decline in total.
Yeah, so there's this. So I have another research on this, but the Turner Center at Berkeley has great research on this, finding that
Mhm.
even literally at like I think they started looking at like a 1 or 2% mandate. I can pull it
Mhm.
up. Like you already see a larger loss of market rate developments than you
Mhm.
get of affordable
Mhm.
housing development. So like the trade-off is quite severe, especially in today's day and age with like higher interest rates. So anyway, I bring that up just because that's an example where I think this talking point of like, well, you know what, we don't want to be attacked for saying we don't support affordable housing, and we want to be able to say, hey, we're requiring affordable housing. Um, that's led to this situation where I think a lot of even the more pro-housing legislators we have,
Mhm.
have kind of talked themselves into the idea that this whole affordable housing, with it's called inclusionary zoning, is a really good policy idea when in fact it's undermining their own goals. And there's lots more examples like that. So I
So
think.
that 20% affordable requirement that they just passed in Cambridge, according to these estimates, is actually a huge deal.
Yeah, and I'm not an economist, so I don't know the details of that. But yeah, this is part of what we're interested in our paper too, is that I think so much of the focus in the study of housing has been this kind of paradigm of like you've got the public meeting and the NIMBYs are going to show up, and why are they showing up? But the fact is that as more and more policymaking moves to the state level, actually what we have to think about is a bunch of other policies like permit streamlining, like for example, what kind of permits get streamlined. Um, and so, as one other example of that, here in San Francisco, we have these policies that say, well, if you're going to get access to various zoning incentives or whatever else, it has to be done by an owner occupant. So,
Yes, yes.
right. And so, why is that done? Right. And I think there's sort of two answers, both
There's
right.
the official story of it's to make sure that the owner gets the profit, which is a lot like saying if you find oil on your land, you have to drill it yourself, or else you won't get the money.
Yeah, and so I think, and the other view of what's happened. So I think, one idea is like this is a way to look like you're doing something without doing anything.
Mhm.
But the other is that part of what they're playing on is politically. And so we have an example like this inspired by some of the housing debates here in San Francisco, where my co-author Chris Elmendorf also lives. We have this example where we ask people about whether or not, or under what conditions you should be able to demolish a small apartment building to build a larger one.
Mhm.
And one of the things we randomize is who wants to do the demolition? Is it the
Ah,
landlord
yes, yes.
or is it a Wall Street investor? And it turns out when you describe it as a Wall Street investor that wants to do it, the support drops by 15 points. And that's driven by people who have negative views towards Wall Street. And so, and we see that in rhetoric about that issue where it's like, oh, well, this is going to open the door for quote unquote speculators, et cetera.
Mhm.
So again and again, be it issues like that, issues of like whether we should streamline environmental reviews, the question of whether or not we should allow what's called third-party permitting, where if the government's too slow to issue a building permit, a third party can do it instead, which actually is the case in many US states and many countries. All of these different policies are, I think, where the real action is on housing politics right now, but they all implicate people's views towards these other symbols out there. Like, what do you think about government, environmental regulations? What do you think about wealthy people? What do you think about landlords versus Wall Street investors? And so the point we're trying to make is that, especially for pro-housing advocates, this is the game that the NIMBYs are playing. It's not just about, homeowner self-interest. It's trying to play on all these other symbols. And I think part of what the YIMBY side of this debate needs to do is to think about, well, what are the symbols that we can use to try to get people on board and say, like, well, here's, the people or groups this policy would help, or the actors this is going to empower that people like, or the actors this will be bad for that you dislike, et cetera.
All right, just one last question. In
Yeah.
the last chapter of Build Baby Build, I go over the public opinion literature on housing, which is before your paper. So I wish that I could have put it in, but I boil it all down to the following four factors, I say objective self-interest is actually not very important. And I say what really matters. So first is economic illiteracy, just denial that building more stuff reduces prices. Another one is innumeracy, where you will freak out over one nest of birds. Another one is what I just call paranoia, kind of inspired by my dad, because whenever there was any development in an area, he would just flip out and start painting the most lurid scenarios. And then the last one is a status quo bias, where things are just the way they ought to be right now. So how good is my list?
I think that's a good list. Yeah, and I think the twist I'd put on it is that those last three, the kind of the character of those
Mhm.
concerns, I think, can kind of be colored by
Mhm.
these other dimensions that housing policies like bring in. Be it, do I like density? Do I
Mhm.
like, the landlords? Do I like Wall Street
Yeah, I'm
investors?
sort of tempted to file it under paranoia and say that if you hear about some group you don't like being involved or something you don't like being involved, then it's the sky's going to fall.
Yeah, or I think paranoia almost makes it sound like, I think maybe for people who, show up, crazy people like me who show up to the SF Planning Commission to give comments, maybe that's the right level of intensity. But I mean, I think the other way to think about it is that, people care about the issue of housing. If you look at local issues, local polls in San Francisco, it's always number one or number two. But people are busy and they don't have time to research all these details. And so part of, what they're coping with is, as Downs, recognized a long time ago, people don't have an incentive to pay attention and think through
Mhm.
these things.
Mhm.
You've written about this too, and so part of what they're doing is kind of queuing off of,
Mhm.
well, if there's all this kind of complicated stuff about housing, but there's something I do know, like, oh, well, Wall Street's involved. Like, I don't understand the rest of it, but I know I don't like them, so like this is a bad idea. That's, I think, part of what's going on too, is maybe less of paranoia than a kind of lack of incentive to figure out the details and therefore kind of using a mental shortcut to fill in the details.
All right. Well, thank you very much, David Brockman. And I really hope that you keep doing more of this. Sounds like you're doing some great work so far, and I'm looking forward to more.
My pleasure.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.